This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Catherine, and I are talking about the way we all as writers study people. We are curious creatures, us writers, and how are we going to create a character if we aren't always putting friends, neighbors, strangers under our version of the microscope? So, Robert, do you want to kind of talk us into this topic?
Sure. I think, unless you're a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist, you probably haven't done major studies into the motivations of people and why and how we do things. So a lot of our, it's shoot from the hip stuff, where you get a feel perhaps for your main character and you understand the goals, the conflict, and where your story's going to end up. But we don't necessarily think about how we're enriching their world with the conflicts that other people bring in and their own needs and wants. And it's obviously it's helpful theoretically to then think that through and say, okay, I've got this supporting cast. What are their needs? What are their wants? What are their goals? But for some people that can be very tedious. One way to enrich in your own view of this, I think, is to simply be curious. And I think a lot of writers are like this. You'll see them sitting in the corner of the cafe scribbling and then looking at you and then scribbling down again. You think, what are they doing? Oh, yeah, they've just found someone they're going to kill off next chapter. But I think that sort of curiosity of why humans do what they do, not necessarily at a deep level, but just understanding that it can happen. In book one of my sci-fi trilogy, it was at the time where in America there's a huge rise in populism, without going into the specific politics or the person. But it was an inspiration for the rise of a certain tribalistic politics on a particular planet, and a character who had learned to manipulate that, who ended up being a bit of a shapeshifter anyway. And so it fueled inspiration. And then I then knew how to make that feel real to the reader, because we have experiences similar to that in our own world. Mm-hmm. And we can understand that some motivations, if you were to take a cold hard look at it, go, why on earth? What is actually reasonable about that? But human beings don't do reasonable things. We're flawed characters. So I think the study of people at an individual level and people at a crowd level is hugely valuable to enriching your writing.
It is. No, absolutely. And I think we do it consciously and unconsciously all the time. I think there's a spectrum of the kind of research we do, from just sitting in the corner at the cafe, observing people and jotting down notes, to knowing a character is going to do a certain thing or have a certain problem, and then, researching it ad nauseum so that we can make it real and bring it to life and make it resonate with readers, whether they're familiar with that issue or not. But then to be as factual as possible for the people who really know the issue. I mean, I would hate to be called out on getting something like that wrong if I could have found the answer while I was doing my writing.
Yes. Okay. So there's a whole contentious area in there that would just be a completely another episode if you talk about, okay, I'm going to write something that's very, that needs sensitivity readers, or, is a very specific issue, but it still doesn't stop us from, if I happen to be observing someone who's, incredibly, is a person with a disability, it doesn't stop me from observing them and understanding how that might figure in my story. And if I then want to have them as a key character, well, then clearly, to do that justice, if I haven't experienced that myself, then I would want to be doing some level of more curious research to get that right.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking in that direction though.
Oh, bummer. I thought we
I
were going to have a
know, I
really
know.
controversial conversation there.
Well, we could dive in. No, I was just thinking more in terms of like procedural stuff or technical stuff.
Yeah, yeah,
If you
yeah,
are
yeah,
writing
yeah.
a police detective story and the way your detective holds her gun is, like Hollywood style that nobody actually does. And then you have readers who know better because they are police or have police in the family or military or whatever, you lose your authenticity with them. So then it's
Yeah.
not even necessarily, I guess I'm going away from psychology, which I didn't mean to do, but even just on that level, thinking about research and the way we deep dive into characters. And I've got clients who might be writing about a sociopath or something. And so then I play the role of being an educated, non expert. So the writer is doing all of the research and finding out, how does a sociopath behave? What issues do I need to bring to the table? What kind of manipulation would occur? If this person doesn't feel guilt, how does this person get through, like a mea culpa situation with somebody they're manipulating? And I get to be the reader who says, this doesn't feel right. Right. And then the writer, this is what I do as a writer and what I do as an editor too, is the fix to when it isn't playing right with the reader is to do more or less. So you can take it out, do something else, and just bystep that issue, or you can add more material to your narrative that then makes what that character is doing work, right? That makes it feel true, that gives it that verisimilitude on the page. So I just took us in a whole nother direction.
No, it was good though. It made me think about what we observe, because as much as being curious and observing and being observant is really helpful in real life, I think, to enriching how we deepen the sense of real, believability, I suppose, is what you're saying, a leader, and authenticity. And they are definitely important to me. I want to read stories where I don't just suddenly think, oh, come on, that's just wrong. And thinking about that, we really need to be careful as creatives not to take our understanding of how things function from popular culture. So, if you were to write a police procedural and all you'd ever seen were episodes of CSI, you'd be getting a lot of things wrong, and so you'd potentially alienate a big audience. But then there are some things where, they're extremely well researched. Off the top of my head, Big Bang Theory, for example, the science that's in there is usually correct. It's one of the, the key things of the show. So, and they've kind of hung their hat on that. So I think you have to be careful what you observe, and that if you think, oh yeah, I want to write that, but that actually isn't how it really happens. They've just happened to use that because it's convenient for film or bite-sized TV. So being curious enough to sort of go as far as you need to for your story.
Right. And what you were saying about being careful what we observe is useful to put it in the real world context too, and not just watching media. If you know one person who will go back to the sociopath who is really manipulative, that doesn't mean that's the right behavior for your character. Maybe that person is an outlier, is on the far side of the of the charts or something, and you would be better off doing more work, more observations, getting more ideas, more grist for the mill as you create your character, and finding the thing that's going to be more representative. With that said, you still want to be creative. You still want to be unique in your expression of that representation and make it fit with your story. But if you rely on the single example, you might get it wrong according to most readers and most experts, or most, There's so many variables that go into shaping how our characters think and feel and behave.
Mm.
How much do you two try to nail down your character's psychology when you're in the development in the first draft phase? Is it important to you to be more or less accurate, as much as you can in this creative process? Or do you just sort of wing it and let the character be the character?
It's really important to me. I've very deliberately done it with my main character, and there are specifically things in this particular book in the series where there is probably a psychological arc, actually, I would say. So it's very specific about something that is going to influence how she makes her decisions, why some of those will be wrong, what she has to learn from that, and how that may then impact actually the climax and how it plays out. So it's central, I suppose, is probably, so definitely there are times where I've had to think about, hang on a minute, this doesn't sound quite like in line, a particular thing. It might have been something she'd have done in the previous book, but now that certain things are played out, she's got new experience and is less sure in some areas, more sure in others. So, yeah. Catherine?
I'm rolling out brand new creative writing workshops this fall, and the first one is coming up fast. Writing backstory into your now story. This is a single topic, single session, live creative writing workshop. We're going to explore the role of backstory in novel writing, because it doesn't just affect your protagonist's motivation, it affects your plot. It has to have an immediate, even urgent bearing on your story's present moment to deserve the ink it takes to write it onto the page. We will go through 3 methods of incorporating backstory into your now story and practice all of them. So come prepared to write, share, and discuss during class. Enrollment is limited because I want everybody to participate. Sign up now at storyworksfiction.com. Oh, and by the way, I've got 2 more single topic, single session workshops coming out this fall. Weaving together character, plot, and theme, and making readers fear or fear for your characters. That first workshop, Backstory, is coming up on September 12th. It's coming up fast. So go to storyworksfiction.com, reserve your seat today, and if you're interested in all 3 of these topics, get the bundle and save 15%. I cannot wait to see you in the classroom.
I was going to say, I don't know that I think about it that much. And then I started thinking about it. So thank you for talking. Because it gave me a second to realize, no, I actually probably do this more or less unconsciously during my character development. Like I don't sit down and say, oh, what's my character's psychology? But I do say, okay, who are they at the core, right? When they were born, who were they from the moment they were born? Strong, permissive, like what kind of person were they? Compliant? Were they just a, good kid who did everything right? Or were they always bucking authority? And then what were some of the key experiences that maybe would have shaped that? Parents got divorced or their dad died in a car crash and, you get these different things, traumatic experiences, things that I want to have huge influence on them, even if they weren't intrinsically traumatic, right? But traumatic to them as a character, and then how that may have played out on who they became because of that, right? And I think that all speaks to some level of motivation and why would they be in the story to begin with, and how will they react to the conflict within it. So I think you kind of do it even if you aren't realizing that you're doing it as you're developing your characters, because you want them to be a certain way. You're digging into that armchair psychology that you've been, experiencing throughout your life. And I think as you guys were talking, I just kept thinking curiosity with empathy. right? So I'm curious and I'm
Definitely
trying to be compassionate and empathize with what's going on rather than judgmental or critical, right? So as I'm watching this maybe single mom with 5 kids across the park, I'm not looking at her going, oh my gosh, like look at her kids. How did she even, like that wouldn't cross my mind. I might instead be like, wow, okay, that's a strong woman who has 5 kids at the park. She made it to the park today, right? And so then I start thinking in my brain how that, went about and maybe how, and then you can start spinning stuff off of that, right? But I think the more you use empathy and compassion, then the more you're going to find deeper things within those psychologies that maybe you aren't even realizing, right? At the front, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah. I was going to, and I stopped myself from going there before because I wanted to hear what you had to say, but you've actually led me into what I was thinking before, which is we live in an incredibly snap judgmental world, and probably in a greater sense than I think we've ever had with, to put a timestamp on it, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic. We've got a chasm of opinions about how it should be handled, and it's I think it's fracturing relationships. I think it's
100%.
it's really tough. And so, we've become even more judgmental, and we're kind of being led down that path, perhaps. So, you're either in this camp or you're in that camp, and there's no in between, and there's no compassion or empathy or curiosity. And it's a struggle, especially on social media. I mean, it's just not worth going down that path. So it's kind of it's a little difficult to then reverse yourself out of that and then put yourself in the frame of, what is their model of the world? How is this conclusion being come to? Now, I think that is a hugely valuable skill to have as a writer, because that way you go beyond, even for your main character, you're starting to think about, people write huge backstories, and obviously that helps them create their character's model of the world, but you don't need to do that. What you need to do is understand the cause effect. One of the things that I loved about neurolinguistic programming is we had a presupposition, which was, everything everybody does always makes sense to them in the moment. No matter how dire from the outside we look at it, even how ugly, how horrible, how cruel, how brutal, how violent, it makes sense to that person in the moment. And sometimes it's the only choice they think they have to. This is why people end up in prison. And, and we look at it and we think, how could you do that? Well, that's a failure to understand a model of the world. So I think as writers, when you read a gifted writer's work, you think, oh my goodness, they've just got inside that person's head. You all of a sudden you understand motivations. Our villain is no longer a moustache twirling, caped culprit. It's a person who is making choices, bad choices, but they're making choices. Yeah, there's my rant.
Well done. Well done. Yeah, I think as writers, we need to be empathetic people. And hopefully writers are empathetic people all the time, not just when they're sitting down at their keyboards. And that what you were saying about building the worldview of your character is essential to developing well-rounded, lifelike human beings on the page. And I think I do what both of you were talking about, and it depends on the character's role in the story. Sometimes the character is, the psychology seems to come out of who the character is in the story, but other times the character's role requires an essential psychology, especially a darker character or a more flawed character, because then understanding that character's essence, motivations, choices goes part and parcel with that character's psychology, sometimes sociopathy, sometimes, traumatic past, sometimes. And so which approach I take to a character depends, but always understanding that worldview is at the heart of making that character real.
Yeah, I'm going to reference an episode. I think we might have rerun it, or I don't know, Up the Emotional Wounds Thesaurus.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
Where we talked a lot about using those emotional wounds. And I think that's a good one to revisit if you're interested in this kind of exploration of especially flawed characters, right? How did they get that flaw? And those wounds that we don't see, and that's another thing about being compassionate and kind to each other is we don't see each other's emotional wounds. We don't know how that person is reacting, why they're reacting that way. It might be because they're hurting, and so it's, just that empathy piece, like, please be empathetic human beings. As a writer, especially
first, and then writers,
and then be a writer. Exactly. Be an empathetic human being and then be a writer.
Yes. Yeah. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and apologies, I'm not going to be able to pull the name of the show or the guest off the top of my head in this moment. But the guest was talking about being with a friend who is going through a really hard time with everything happening in the world right now, and said this friend had, grandparents who were Holocaust survivors and parents who's something else. And she had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and hadn't slept through the night for 4 years. And so there was this cascade of reasons why she was struggling so much right now that go from her ancestry to, her childhood home life and whatever those influences were, to just physical stuff like not getting a good night's sleep for a prolonged period of time. And there was more to it. But as we're talking about the emotional wounds and the things under the skin and our character's psychology, it's really useful to remember that somebody's reaction in the moment, whether it's somebody on the street or a character on the page, might seem extreme until you look at all of the layers beneath what's happening in the moment. And if we are doing our job well as writers, then the reader is going to understand those things by the time we get to that moment on the page. So if our character blows up, has a level 8 reaction to a situation that the other character thinks is a level 2 event, we don't want the reader to have that supporting character's reaction. We want the reader to be like, yeah, I'm with you, because we've built in enough of the backstory and the psychology and the motivations and the home life, those other factors, to build up to this moment. And if we do that, then that moment, that reaction is really satisfying. Even if it's a negative reaction with bad consequences, as readers, it's earned. It belongs on the page.
Indeed.
Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.